Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware, A-W-A-R-E, is the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, July 18th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for the wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, or North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Aware was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7 October 2001, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of Aware saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it's in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals, from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Russia has 15, China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. Here in Champaign-Urbana, one of the few fora that actually produces opinions on various sides of this issue is the letters column of the News-Gazette, which editorially is hardly a beacon light of opposition to American war policy. Nevertheless, they do publish things like the brief letter I sent them last week expressing Aware's concerns. Quote, "We must demand that our government remove all our troops and weapons from the Mideast. The recent discussion between Presidents Putin and Trump has begun a partial ceasefire in Syria, which should be extended to all of the country. Russian troops are there at the invitation of a legitimate government, while the U.S. had no legal right to invade Syria. More than 2 generations ago, the Kennedy administration illegally invaded South Vietnam and carried on a war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam and environs, and eventually killed perhaps 4 million people, including more than 50,000 Americans. If American leaders from those days were tried as German leaders were at Nuremberg after World War II, many would have been hanged. By 1969, polls showed that 70% of Americans had come to regard the war in Vietnam as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. American public opinion, the brave resistance of the Vietnamese people, and the revolt of the U.S. conscript army in Vietnam led to eventual American withdrawal. As in Southeast Asia long ago, so in Southwest Asia today, the U.S. must withdraw from what the Pentagon calls MENA, Mideast and North Africa, where we have long been killing people to guarantee control of the energy wealth of the region. Control and not just access is what the U.S. government demands, because it's a chokehold over economies like those of Germany and China that are dependent on Mideast gas and oil. The U.S., in contrast, imports very little of either from MENA, but we're killing people to make sure that we can continue to control it. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram for comments.
Well, Carl, this morning, it's always Tuesday morning that I get something new that causes me or compels me to come in here and mention it. This is the Mali War, which is now spilling into Burkina Faso, if I'm saying that correctly, and Niger. This is by Thomas Geist of the WSWS, or World Socialist website. 4.5 years after the January 2013 invasion of Mali by a U.S.-backed French invasion force, the war is spiraling toward a larger regional conflict, prompting border closures by neighboring governments and spurring escalations by the Western governments. Mali's border areas are experiencing a significant expansion of violent extremist and terrorist activities, including coordinated cross-border attacks against security posts and ransacking of border settlements. This is according to the United Nations top official for West Africa on Thursday. Additionally, opposition groups staged protests over the weekend in Bamako, that's Mali's capital, rallying thousands of demonstrators in the name of blocking proposed legal changes that would transfer emergency powers to the government of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. And forgive me, please, people, for my mispronunciations. Last Monday, 8 Malian troops were ambushed and killed traveling between Gao and Menaka. And on Wednesday, Burkina Faso armed forces clashed with heavily armed militants along the Burkina-Mali border. On Friday, Mauritania, how do you say that, Carl? Mauritania?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Okay. Declared its northeastern border a closed militarized area, announcing that any...
Oh, Mauritania, I'm
Mauritania,
sorry. Right.
yeah.
Yes.
See, you didn't know what I was saying, so... Yeah, announcing it's a militarized area, and that any individual circulating or transiting in this part of the national territory will be treated as a military target. Then on July 8th, JNIM attacked a French army base near the town of Tesselit, killing at least 3 French soldiers. On July 9th, JNIM fighters attacked a police station in Mopti province. In March, Mali's main Islamist factions, Ansardine, al-Mourtabita, I'm killing these names, I'm sorry. The Messina factions and al-Qaeda announced their merger into a new formation, Nusrat al-Islam, under the leadership of Iyad Ag-Ghali. An al-Qaeda branch in Mali, known as the Support of Islam and Muslims, that's the JNIM that I was referring to, attacked a Nigerian garrison near the village of Sawa along the Mali-Niger border in June. Now, French President Macron, this is where it gets important to understand. Macron traveled to Timbuktu at the beginning of July to discuss plans to expand the G5 Sahel multinational army, an imperialist proxy coalition established in February 2014. It consists of forces from the governments of Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. Then on July 2nd, Macron called on the G5 coalition to contribute 5,000 soldiers in support of French military activities against terrorists, thugs, and murderers. So this force is first going to secure the borders, particularly in the areas where terrorist groups have developed, quote, French Foreign Minister Yves Drian telling Le Monde.
Mm-hmm.
He said, it doesn't look like France will be pulling out of Mali anytime soon. Complementing expanding French military operations, the German parliament voted in January to expand troop deployments in Mali from 350 to 1,000, making Mali the German military's largest overseas mission. The immediate causes of the Mali war flowed from the fallout from the 2011 U.S.-NATO war against Libya. Beginning in January 2012, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, or MNLA, that's a Tuareg ethnic militia, launched an insurrection against the central government and established control over portions of northern Mali. Then in March 2012, a coup d'etat led by government soldiers declaring themselves the National Committee for the Restoration of Democracy and State, or CNRDR, removed President Amadou Touré from power. Rebel militia groups seized control of Malian cities of Gao, Timbuktu, and Kidal in the wake of the coup. So from January 2013, Paris responded with repeated waves of troop deployments with backing from Washington. The 2013 invasion Operation Serval served as the spearhead for a major expansion of French militarism across the country's former colonial holdings in West Africa. Now, in exchange for French assistance in stabilizing northern Mali, Paris demanded and received basing rights for its troops throughout the country. Previous Malian governments had been among the few regimes in Francophone Africa to resist such arrangements, limiting French military activities to small-scale training of local forces. Prior to 2013, French combat troops had been absent from Malian territory since their withdrawal following the country's formal independence in 1960. So as part of Operation Barkhane, the successor to Serval, some 6,000 French ground troops, hundreds of armored vehicles, warplanes, attack helicopters, and drones are now deployed throughout the Sahel. Additional German and French troops deployed under European Union flags in February 2014 for the official purpose of training of Malian units. The American and European ruling elites are determined to tighten their grip over the Sahel, which is home to massive natural resource deposits, including uranium and numerous precious metals, and is speculated to have the largest untapped petroleum reserves in Africa. Mali's northern Todani Basin has been known to contain large gas and petroleum reserves since the 70s. In 2011, the French firm Total claimed to have found the El Dorado of petroleum reserves in the northern desert region. A 2015 U.S. geological analysis found that the Todani Basin contains 160 million barrels of conventional oil. And I'm going to stop there because it gets into a lot of details related to shale gas, shale oil, conventional gas, etc., etc., etc. Basically, involvement by French, German, and other EU forces in the Sahel is part of a major new direction in European security policy, according to the European Council on Foreign Relations, the ECFR. So for the European powers, the Sahel represents a second front in the war on terror that is building alongside a growing number of multinationals hoping to extract oil and gas reserves of Mali and Mauritania, and strong French military presence, according to Environmental Justice Atlas. In addition to seizing control over the continent's resources and asserting the interest of the dominant European banks and corporations, The European powers view the militarization of the Sahel as a means to suppress the flood of refugees northward toward the Mediterranean. These policies are aimed at reasserting the colonial order established by world imperialism during the 19th and 20th centuries. Throughout the period of decolonization from the 60s onward, the economies and societies of West Africa were subordinated to the needs of French imperialism through an array of mechanisms, including control over African currency, reserves, and raw materials, monopoly rights for French firms in all key sectors of the economy, and permanent military and police basing arrangements on African soil. Dozens of coups d'etats have been engineered from Paris against African governments, beginning with the assassination of Togo's head of state, Sylvanus Olympio, in 1963, who made the fatal mistake of attempting to transition Togo's economy to its own national currency. Malian President Modibo Keïta met a similar fate after seeking to leave the French currency zone in June 1962. Then in 75 and again in 89, French military officers organized the overthrow of Chadian presidents in 2003. French troops toppled Central African Republic President Patasse, placing in power General Bouzizi after Patasse sought to expel France's military presence from the CAR. So at present, nearly 2,000 French troops are operating in Central African Republic as part of a peacekeeping mission alongside African Union troops. I have to stop there because I know it's really boring to have to read things, and I do recommend that people go to the World Socialist website, .org website, where this article and many others, I find myself constantly coming in here on Tuesday mornings with an article that I had just read that I feel is absolutely what is the word I want to use, Carl? I mean, it's when you look at what they are doing, and this is what our wars against terrorism are all about. I mean, and it's just about killing and stealing. Now, here on the map, and we talked about this in the past when we discussed Libya and what had happened to Libya, and with the fall of Gaddafi, that the U.S. and NATO were behind. And now we see our French allies, our French partners. We see how, I mean, basically you have the Western powers between the U.S., between Germany, between France, literally dividing up the resources of this whole continent. So with Libya, we knew almost immediately after, as reported here, Mali. It brought about a lot of fighting in Mali. And I can't read the fine print on here, so this isn't going to help me very much. But it's all in that vicinity of known as the Sahel. And we know that Chad has been a nation whereby a lot of the weapons that are being distributed are coming through Chad and Libya and then being distributed throughout that region. So what took place in 2011 has ushered in so much more. And this is what I think we keep seeing unfolding before us, is that whatever we see happening in one nation, it usually, as I keep pointing out, it's geopolitical. And as you do, Carl, it's geopolitical because it's never just one nation, just as we've talked about Syria. What is happening in Syria today, it's being carved up or partitioned. There are specific areas that the various different governments wish to control. And it's because Syria, a lot has to do with Iran, and we know that there's just so much going on, and it is really, really devastating. It's devastating to our environment. It's devastating to the people of these nations, the famine, and they've planned all along. When we talk about helping the immigrants, the refugees, I mean. It's like applying, I hate to say it, to good people who are trying to help refugees, but at the end of the day, it's applying Band-Aids. What we really need is a heart surgeon. And the heart surgeon is the person who, basically is to save lives. We need to stop the wars. If we stop the wars and we stop the killing, then we can prevent the bleeding of the people fleeing all of the devastation that is being created.
I think it's necessary, too, to begin to see the wars going on in what the Pentagon calls MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, as you suggested, connected. We tend to hear news accounts, if we do at all, about Syria or about Afghanistan or occasionally about Mali, very rarely, I might say.
Right.
But the point is that these are all connected. I'm old enough to recall the anti-Vietnam War movement and the groups that were involved in that, and we all learnt a lot in those days when we were very young, and the war itself was underway, and we were only slowly becoming aware of it. And one of the first things we learnt, and we would repeat this to one another with a certain surprise, was that when it came to American foreign policy and American military policy, which both have to do with killing people, everything is connected.
Yeah.
And it's the connections, and sometimes, in some cases, that are particularly difficult to see because there's such an effort by the American media to make sure that these are treated as separate or discrete, in one sense of the word, events that are not bound up in the overall policy of the United States of America, the only undamaged power to emerge from World War II, that is indeed killing people around the world in order to maintain that power. Our job here at Aware on the Air is to try to promote discussion of the real war situation that the United States is responsible for, that the rest of the world recognizes, but that Americans, as a result of the most sophisticated system of information control and propaganda the world has ever seen, don't for the most part know about. Not 1 in 10 of our educated listeners would have been able to say anything at all about what the military situation in Mali is. But it is bound up with all these other things, including the recent visit of the President of the United States to Paris and his discussion with the French President Macron, who is the head of the government, which was the colonial power in Mali, and is very much involved with the military events you were talking about. Everything is connected, and it's important that Americans, who after all are at least technically and constitutionally responsible for this killing going on around the world, to become aware of it. That's why the American media and the American government spend so much time and effort trying to distract your attention from what's going on there, because what's going on there is very different from the accounts that we normally get about that, if we get any account at all. And we don't hear about Mali, right?
No, and two things I want to point out. I remember discussing Boko Haram and how I was very suspicious back, I think it was early 2014, when suddenly we were sending in U.S. troops to Nigeria because young girls, African American, listen to me, African girls were being kidnapped by they call it a jihadist group, but I don't know how jihadist it is, but basically it's a group of, they are terrorists, Boko Haram. But as some people pointed out, wait a minute, we don't care about missing African American girls here in America. Why are we so concerned about them missing in Nigeria? And of course, Nigeria is also a very oil dominated nation. They're one of the largest African nations when it comes to oil resources. But excuse me, and we've continued. So every time I read something about the Boko Haram and the slaves and the girls, I mean, because people, what we have to understand is the U.S., we are not exceptional. People can handle their own problems. Nations can handle their own problems. They do not need our help. And right here it's pointed out that some 5.2 million have already been displaced by the Western-backed Chadian-led invasion of northern Nigeria, justified in the name of fighting Boko Haram. So while we may not have all seen it back in 2014, we certainly can see it now because we see what has evolved. And that's the second point that I want to make, is that it's no one U.S. president who is in charge of what we're doing and our war policies, because these are policies that have been set going back many years, because you see how they go back, and they show all of the troops that were being placed in some of these areas back years ago. Even the French colonialists, even the write-up of their some of the agreements that they had allowed them to keep their troops in place in order to continue this. So it's all about, it has always been about control of resources that we don't want others to have. So I think, and you've pointed that out, Carl, you were the first one I ever heard that from. If any of these nations, if their product was broccoli, I think you said, do you think we would be over there? No. And it's not that we even use their oil. It's because we don't want China and Russia having access to it.
I think I said asparagus because
asparagus.
I like broccoli better than asparagus,
Okay.
but that's a personal concern.
Okay.
This article and others like it will be on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, and you can find this, as I say, and others there. We will try to make sure that those are available if you want to follow these points up. You're watching Aware on the Air. I'd like to turn back to the fundamental situation in the U.S. that sparks wars like this, the source of the American involvement, and as you point out, origination of many of these conflicts. For about 40 years now, we've spoken of neoconservatives in the United States. Neoconservatives are not just new conservatives, as the Latin might imply. Neoconservatives refer to those people who have been afraid that the revulsion against the war in Vietnam would lead America into a period of popular retrenchment in its foreign wars. That is, that we would pull back from killing people abroad because we were so appalled at what had happened in Southeast Asia. There was a very real worry in American ruling circles about that in the 1970s, and the people who were most explicit about insisting on the necessity of using American military power abroad were called neoconservatives, and that the neoconservative position was in fact a rejection of traditional American conservatism, which had a long and honorable history of non-interventionism. The neoconservative position was a reversal of the traditional conservative position that said the U.S. should not have troops abroad, the U.S. should not intervene in foreign wars, a position that in some ways goes back to the foundations of the United States. George Washington's farewell address, for example. The neoconservatives were consciously rejecting that conservative position and insisting, no, the U.S. has got to go about the world seeking for beasts to destroy, and most of them actually to look Russian and Chinese. That's the neoconservative position for, as I say, more than a generation now. An important contemporary columnist, Glenn Greenwald, has pointed out what the neocons are up to today, and this is his account. One of the most under-discussed, yet consequential changes in the American political landscape is the reunion between the Democratic Party and the country's most extreme and discredited neocons. While the rise of Donald Trump, whom neocons loathe, remember Trump had the temerity to criticize some of the war provocations that the Obama administration was carrying out against Russia and China. With the rise of Donald Trump, whom neocons loathe, has accelerated this realignment. It began long before the ascension of Trump and is driven far more by common beliefs than contempt for the current president. He's talking here now about the conjunction of the neocon opinion and the Democratic Party, which at some points tried to pretend that it was anti-war. Elements in the Democratic Party in the early 70s spoke that way at the time of the nomination of George McGovern. A newly formed and by all appearances well-funded national security advocacy group devoted to more hawkish U.S. policies toward Russia and other adversaries provides the most vivid evidence yet of this alliance. Calling itself the Alliance for Securing Democracy, of course, the group describes itself as, quote, a bipartisan transatlantic initiative that will develop comprehensive strategies to defend against, deter, and raise the costs on Russian and other state actors' efforts to undermine democracy and democratic institutions, and also will work to publicly document and expose Vladimir Putin's ongoing efforts to subvert democracy and the United States and Europe, close quote. What would they do with that Putin as a whipping boy, huh? I mean, the evil genius, the new Hitler, as Hillary Clinton said, is clearly behind all the machinations that the U.S. has to oppose by these foreign wars, by killing people around the world. It is, in fact, the ultimate union of mainstream Democratic foreign policy officials and the world's most militant and militaristic neocons. The group is led by two longtime Washington foreign policy hands, one from the establishment Democratic wing and the other a key figure among leading GOP neocons. I've been arguing for a while that when it comes particularly to foreign policy, we really don't have too much to choose between the parties, Republican, Democrat, or even between groups that have been traditionally thought of as left and right in America. The old line was that politics stops at the water's edge, and in some ways that's more true today when the neocons dominate the discussion of foreign policy in ways that they hadn't for a long time. The two people at the head of this new conjunction, Republican-Democratic conjunction for securing democracy, the Alliance Securing Democracy, the Democrat Laura Rosenberger served as a foreign policy advisor for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and chief of staff to two Obama national security officials. The Republican is Jamie Fly, who spent the last 4 years as counselor for foreign and national security affairs to one of the Senate's most hawkish members, Marco Rubio. Prior to that, he served in various capacities in the Bush Pentagon and National Security Council. Everything is connected. Fly's neocon pedigree is impressive indeed. During the Obama years, he wrote dozens of articles for the Weekly Standard, a major neocon journal edited by William Kristol, attacking Obama for insufficient belligerence towards Iran and terrorists in general, pronouncing Obama, quote, increasingly ill-suited to the world he faces as president, by virtue of his supposed refusal to use military force frequently enough. There's certain ironies here. As I mentioned earlier, Obama is the first president in history to be at war throughout two complete presidential terms. But the neocons, of course, were saying he's a wimp, he's not killing enough people, he should be pressed to do more. Obama bombed 7 predominantly Muslim countries during his time in office, including an average of 72 bombs dropped per day in 2016 alone. The Democrats' new partner, Jamie Fly, spent 2010 working in tandem with Bill Kristol at the magazine I just mentioned, urging military action, that is, aggressive war, against Iran. In a 2010 Weekly Standard article co-written with Kristol, Fly argued that, quote, the key to changing Iran's thinking about its nuclear program is a serious debate about the military option, adding, it's time for Congress to seriously explore an authorization of military force to halt Iran's nuclear program. Now, authorization for military force, for the use of military force, is the Washington neologism for a war declaration. This has become popular in the 21st century in Washington. It's a way of getting around the constitutional provisions about when the U.S. can make war, and so they're calling now for an authorization for the use of military force against Iran. Fly, the head of the Democratic member of this, the Republican member of this new joint neocon group, then went around the D.C. think tank circuit under the guise of advocating debate, espousing the need to use military force against Iran, spouting standing neocon innuendos such as, quote, "We need to be wary of the Obama administration's intentions towards Iran." They couldn't quite use the word treason yet. They hadn't got Putin and Trump together, but they could say that Obama is really not doing what he should be doing in killing people in this regard. He hasn't attacked, he hasn't loosed the bombers on Iran yet. He mocked Obama officials and Bush officials before them for their, quote, "obsession with diplomatic options," close quote. How dare they use diplomacy rather than bombs on Iran? The Crystal Fly duo returned in 2012 to more explicitly argue, quote, "Isn't it time for the President to ask Congress for an authorization for use of military force against Iran's nuclear program?" Now, these are the people, once again, not limited to any party or even any administration, who are putting such pressure now on the Trump administration to attack Iran. Beyond working as Rubio's foreign policy advisor, Fly was the executive director of, quote, "the Foreign Policy Initiative," a group founded by Crystal, the same William Crystal, along with two other leading neocons, Robert Kagan and Dan Senor, who was previously the chief spokesman for the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. If you don't recall the Coalition Provisional Authority, that was the government that the U.S. imposed on Iraq after invading the country in 2003. That group is devoted to standard neocon agitprop, demanding agitprop is such a wonderful old word. I'm not sure we can count on its being as well known. Agitprop refers to agitation and propaganda. That is the attempt to convince a government to make war. And that's obviously what this group is devoted to. The group is devoted to standard neocon agitprop, demanding, quote, "a renewed commitment to American leadership." We know where that leadership is going, right? On the ground that the United States remains the world's indispensable nation. In some, as it was said during the 2016 campaign, if you want a foreign policy advisor with strong ties to the neocon world, it's hard to do better than Jamie Fly. When it comes to this new group, the alliance of Democrats with the most extreme neocon elements is visible beyond the group's staff leadership. Its board of advisors is composed of both leading Democratic foreign policy experts along with the nation's most extremist neocons. Thus, alongside Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor to Joe Biden and the Clinton campaign, Mike Morrell, Obama's acting CIA director, you may remember.
Oh God.
Yeah, you may remember Morrell.
Oh.
He was the one who said we've got to start
He's
killing
mad.
more Russians
Yeah.
in Syria so that they'll know we're serious about keeping the Russians out of Syria.
Excuse
Mike
me, but on top of that, this does need to be pointed out. Mike Morrell has admitted that when he gave the information to President Bush and others in relation to the attack on 9/11, that he knew some of the information being passed by was wrong. And he's been asked, well, why didn't you say something? He said, oh, well, that's not my job.
He's an interesting example of the
Mad.
Well, that may be true, but he's also an interesting example of what we've come recently, perhaps misleadingly, to call the deep state. The deep
Yes.
state being that sort of collection of second-level bureaucrats and officials and whatnot, who have a great deal of influence, even by outright lying, as you suggest, on what the presumed leaders of the country decide to do in terms of particularly foreign policy. In sum, just as was true in the first Cold War, when neocons made their home among the cold warriors of the Democratic Party, on the key foreign policy controversies, there's now little or no daylight between leading Democratic foreign policy gurus and the Bush-era neocons who had wallowed in disgrace following the debacle of Iraq and the broader abuses of the War on Terror. They're back. That's why they're able so comfortably to unify this way in support of common foreign policy objectives and beliefs. And we'll be clear here that what they're most worried about is that these common foreign policy objectives and beliefs will not be entirely embraced by the Trump administration. And that's why they are so concerned about making sure Trump either toes the line or is removed. It's true that neocons were among the earliest and most vocal GOP opponents of Trump. That was because they viewed him as an ideological threat to their orthodoxies, such as when he advocated for U.S. neutrality on the Israel-Palestine conflict and railed against the wisdom of the wars in Iraq and Libya. He did do that during the campaign and was under intense pressure, of course, to get with the program. But they were also worried that his uncouth, offensive personality would embarrass the U.S. and thus weaken the soft power needed for imperial hegemony. Even if Trump could be brought into line on neocon orthodoxy, as has largely happened, his ineptitude and instability posed a threat to their agenda. And we had an interesting example of that if we look closely at what happened in Paris and his involvement in the also difficult to interpret new president of France, Emmanuel Macron. But Democrats and neocons share far more than revulsion towards Trump. Particularly once Hillary Clinton became the party's standard bearer, they share the same fundamental beliefs about the U.S. role in the world and how to assert U.S. power. In other words, this alliance is explained by far more than antipathy to Trump. Indeed, the likelihood of a neocon-Democrat reunion long predates Trump. Back in the summer of 2014, almost a year before Trump announced his intent to run for president, longtime neocon watcher Jacob Heilbrunn, writing in the New York Times, predicted, quote, that the neocons may be preparing a more brazen feat, aligning themselves with Hillary Rodham Clinton in her nascent presidential campaign in a bid to return to the driver's seat of American foreign policy. And that's exactly what they did do. The major neocons abandoned the Republicans even before Trump was nominated and rallied to Clinton's campaign because she could be counted on to produce a warlike policy at least as vigorous as the Obama administration's. Noting the Democratic Party's decades-long embrace of the Cold War belligerents that neocons love most, from Truman and JFK to LBJ and Scoop Jackson, Heilbrunn documented the prominent neocons who, throughout Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State, were heaping praise on her and moving to align with her. Heilbrunn explained the natural ideological affinity between neocons and established Democrats. Quote, and the thing is, these neocons have a point. Mrs. Clinton voted for the Iraq War, supported sending arms to Syrian rebels, likened Russia's President Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler, wholeheartedly backs Israel, and stresses the importance of promoting democracy. One finds evidence of this alliance long before the emergence of Trump. Victoria Nuland, for instance, served as one of Dick Cheney's top foreign policy advisor during the Bush years. Married to one of the most influential neocons, Robert Kagan, Nuland then seamlessly shifted into the Obama State Department and then became a top foreign policy advisor to the Clinton campaign. We don't even mention that she was prominently involved in the coup in Ukraine
yeah.
that produced the threat that Americans keep finding, that some Americans keep finding in the reaction of the Russian government. As anti-war, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, the media had a field day talking about that. Unfortunately, all the focus was on, oh, our diplomat used the F word.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
but listen to what she actually was saying.
That's
There's proof who was behind the coup
Killing
d'etat.
people is okay, but
yeah,
don't
it's like,
swear.
oh,
Don't swear.
don't use
Come
the
on.
F word, geez.
Yeah. As anti-war sentiment grew among some GOP precincts, as evidenced by the success of the Ron Paul candidacies of 2008 and 2012, and then Trump's early posturing as an opponent of U.S. interventions, neocons started to conclude that their agenda, which never changed, would be better advanced by a realignment back into the Democratic Party. Writing in The Nation in early 2016, Matt Dust detailed how the neocon mentality was losing traction within the GOP and predicted, quote, yet another possibility is the neocons will start to migrate back to the Democratic Party, which they exited in the 1970s in response to Vietnam-inspired anti-interventionism. That's what earned their faction the neo prefix in the first place. There are signs that prominent neocons have started gravitating towards Hillary Clinton's campaign. But the question is, now this was long before that became obvious, but the question is, now that the neocons had been revealed as having no real grassroots to deliver, and that their actual constituency consists almost entirely of a handful of donors subsidizing a few dozen think tanks, journalists, and letterheads, why would Democrats want them back? Well, that may have been, close quote, that was the question that was being posed in 2014. The fact of the matter was that those things do make a difference. The answer to that question, why would Democrats want them back, is clear. Because as this new group demonstrates, Democrats find large amounts of common cause with neocons when it comes to foreign policy. Thus, when it came time for Democrats to elevate Putin and Russia into a major theme of the 2016 campaign, try to tar Trump with that brush, and now that their hawkishness towards Moscow is their go-to weapon for attacking Trump, neocons have become their natural ideological allies. The song Democrats are now singing about Russia and Putin is one the neocons wrote many years ago, and all the accompanying rhetorical tactics, including those who seek better relations with Moscow, of being Putin's stooges and unpatriotic, of suspect loyalties, etc., are the ones that have defined the neocon smear campaign for decades. The union of Democrats and neocons is far more than a temporary marriage of convenience designed to bring down a common enemy, that is Trump. As this new policy group illustrates, the union is grounded in widespread ideological agreement on a broad array of foreign policy debates, from Israel to Syria to the Gulf states to Ukraine to Russia. And the narrow differences that exist between the two groups, on the wisdom of the Iran deal, for example, or the nobility of the Iraq War, the justifiability of torture, are more relics of past debates than current live controversies. These two groups have found common cause because, with rare and limited exception, they share common policy beliefs and foreign policy mentalities. The implications of this reunion, that is, neocons and Democrats, are profound and long-term. Neocons have done far more damage to the U.S. and the world than any other single group by a good margin. They were the architects of the invasion of Iraq and the lies that accompanied it, the worldwide torture regime instituted after 9/11, and the general political climate that equated dissent with treason. With the full-scale discrediting and collapse of the Bush presidency, these war-loving neocons found themselves marginalized without any constituency in either party. They were radioactive, confined to speaking at extremist conferences and working with fringe organizations. All of that has changed, thanks to the eagerness of Democrats to embrace them, form alliances with them, and thus rehabilitate their reputations and resurrect their power and influence. That leading Democratic Party foreign policy officials are willing to form new Beltway advocacy groups, Washington, D.C. groups, in collaboration with Bill Kristol, Mike Rogers, and Mike Chertoff, notable neocons from the Bush era, join arms with those who caused the invasion of Iraq and tried to launch a bombing campaign against Tehran, or against Iran, has repercussions that will easily survive the Trump presidency. Perhaps the most notable fact about the current posture of the establishment wing of the Democratic Party is that one of their favorite, most beloved, and most cited pundits is the same neocon who wrote George W. Bush's oppressive, bullying, and deceitful speeches in 2002 and 2003 about Iraq and the war on terror, and has churned out some of the most hateful, inflammatory rhetoric over the past decade about Palestinians, immigrants, and Muslims. That Bush propagandist, David Frum, is regularly feted on MSNBC's liberal programs, has been hired by The Atlantic, which has taken nasty turns recently, where he writes warnings about authoritarianism, even though he's only qualified to write manuals for its implementation, and is treated like a wise and honored statesman by leading Democratic Party organs. One sees this same dynamic repeated with many other of the world's most militaristic, war-loving neocons. Particularly after his recent argument with Tucker Carlson over Russia, Democrats have practically canonized Max Boot, who has literally cheered for every possible war over the 2 past decades, and in 2013 wrote a column titled, quote, "No need to repent for support of Iraq war," close quote. It is now common to see Democratic pundits and office holders even favorably citing and praising William Kristol himself. There's certainly nothing wrong with discrete argument on a particular issue with someone of a different party ideology. That's to be encouraged. But what's going on here goes far, far beyond that. What we see instead are leading Democratic foreign policy experts joining hands with the world's worst neocons to form new broad-based policy advocacy groups to reshape U.S. foreign policy toward a more hostile, belligerent, and hawkish posture. We see not isolated agreements with neocons in opposition to Trump or on single-issue debates, but a full-scale embrace of them that's rehabilitating their standing, empowering their worst elements, and reintegrating them back into the Democratic Party power structure. This is the Glenn Greenwald's account of where the war party is going in Washington these days, and the answer is straight into the Democratic Party. They're already in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. This is a very dangerous situation, and the point that Greenwald doesn't make, and I think is worth stressing, is that this sort of activity is necessary because the general mood of the American public is finally anti-war. A very interesting study recently says that the reason the reason that Clinton lost the election were certain key districts in the Midwest and from Michigan to Pennsylvania. Certain key districts where the vote went against Clinton because she was presumed to be much more pro-war than Trump, and these communities had been hurt by casualties, American casualties, from the wars in the Middle East. The Obama administration went out of his way to make sure that there were not major American casualties from the ongoing wars in the Middle East, but there were, given in part the employment situation in America, there were sections of the country that were particularly hard hit by American casualties in the Obama years, precisely because there weren't other jobs and people went into the military because that was indeed something one could do. The interesting point about this study is that those communities most hard hit by that voted against Clinton, and that it's possible to interpret the results of the last presidential election as being an anti-war vote in that regard. What that indicates, what that shows, is what polls also show us, that Americans are not, for the most part, interested in carrying on the vast imperialist wars that the U.S. is conducting in the Middle East. And that's one of the reasons the U.S. government and its attendant media want to be quiet about them. That's a reason Americans don't know that we have thousands of troops carrying on war in the Middle East. The politics of the matter are clear. But what Greenwald points out is that the war party, those interested in maintaining the war making of the United States, infect now the Democratic Party as much as they do the Republicans. That's the reason that it's a battle by night on the political forum, on the political front, and that we have very little open discussion of the wars that are going on, not only in obscure places like Mali, as Karen was talking about earlier, but up front in the Middle East, where these issues have always come to a head.
Yeah, can I interject now? Okay, I don't agree that Trump won the election because people voted against Hillary because they were anti-war. All right. I think
some people do. That's what that's what the study shows.
Well, I know people were anti-war. But I think that the majority of people who supported Trump across the Midwest primarily, it was because they are suffering due to the policies that have been slowly, I use the word rather, slowly creating austerity. And I think that they've been suffering from that. And a lot of people, primarily the young students who were suffering from student debt, were out there supporting Bernie. And Bernie never touched on foreign policy. He never touched on war. He was not an anti-war candidate. So I think those people, when they saw what the Democratic Party did to Bernie, that he was sidelined, they stayed home, all right? And that's how I think Trump got in. But either way, I think that all of this points out, whether it's Glenn Greenwald, much of what you've been talking about, is that it's not about a particular party that's going to save us, because it's about the system. If we do not do something about changing the system, as you said, the deep state, and all of that which it comprises. I saw Oksana Boyko on RT interviewing a high-ranking member of the members of the Council on Foreign Relations of the U.S. And while he wasn't supporting war, you could just tell from the propaganda he was spewing about how we need to do this because we want to do away with terrorism, constantly spewing out the word terrorism. So every time you hear that kind of talk, you have to look at it and recognize what the purpose and what the point behind it is. And they're just one of very powerful groups within the deep state. The other is the contractors and the subcontractors and the Pentagon. I mean, a lot of the troop movements and a lot of the military movements, we know it takes a lot of time to have a military presence in a nation. And it doesn't just happen overnight. So a lot of the troop movements, whether it's French, whether it's German, whether it's U.S., these have been planned way in advance by the powers that be. And that is why I'm saying focusing on elections, focusing on either of our two-party system, which actually now, as you point out, the neocons will support either party as long as they do their bidding. And this is why you're absolutely right. The fact that Trump is trying to make, this has brought about détente with Putin, is anathema to their goals. So they're going after him, and much of Russiagate and all this propaganda that we hear about, I mean, that's already been put to bed because there's no evidence of anything. So I really, really strongly want to point that out. And I wanted to mention, too, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the architect of supplying weapons to al-Qaeda back when he was a Democrat working for the Carter administration as was the Foreign Secretary, I believe. Was that his title?
National Security Advisor? National
Security Advisor, I'm sorry, yes. Then he went to work for Reagan in a lesser prominent position as an advisor, and he was a very prominent advisor to the Obama administration. So when you look at the powers behind the throne, that is where you will see what is actually taking place. And I think this article by Glenn Greenwald is very important. And very quickly, I just want to mention that Afghan civilian death toll over the last months is worse. It's absolutely worse since records began in 2009. Now, they should have started before that, we know. And they go back before our intervention in Afghanistan or the intervention with U.S. troops that the American public knows about. And I also want to mention that the cost of making Western Mosul livable is double previous estimates, according to the UN, because Mosul has been totally devastated by the so-called liberation. So I had to get those two points in.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 29th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Penno. Thanks to him also. This program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to tonight. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. This is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.